The doctrine of original sin is one of the most unsettling ideas ever developed in the history of religion. It tells people that before they even take their first breath, they are already guilty. They are already stained. They already carry a fault that they cannot remove on their own. This belief has shaped how countless people have seen themselves, their bodies, their minds, and their lives. It has created a framework where fear is not just an occasional feeling, but the foundation of one's relationship to existence. When a newborn enters the world, religion says that child does not arrive innocent. Instead, it arrives broken, in need of cleansing, dependent on authority, and in debt before it can even think. The origins of this idea are tied to the story of Adam and Eve, a story told not as myth or metaphor, but as if it were a literal historical event. According to the narrative, two humans disobeyed a divine order, ate from a tree, and through that single act, they brought a curse upon every generation that followed. What is striking is not only the story itself, but the logic behind it. One decision, made by two individuals in a setting no human alive has ever seen, is claimed to ripple down through millennia and contaminate billions of lives that had no part in it. No court on earth would punish children for the crimes of their ancestors. Yet this doctrine insists that the ultimate judge does exactly that. The fear it creates is not fear of punishment for one's own actions, but fear of a fault supposedly written into the very fabric of human nature. This fear has been used as a powerful tool of control. If people are convinced that their default condition is corruption, they will constantly seek someone to rescue them. They will submit to authority that promises forgiveness. They will accept rituals, sacraments, and dogmas, not out of curiosity or joy, but out of dread of what might happen if they fail to comply. Fear becomes the leash that keeps people tied to an institution. When a child grows up being told that they are damaged by nature, they learn to distrust their own thoughts and desires. They see themselves not as whole, but as defective. This breaks confidence and creates dependence. And that dependence feeds the very system that instilled the fear in the first place. There are striking psychological consequences. Studies in developmental psychology show that children who are raised with heavy guilt-based frameworks often develop anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming a healthy sense of self-worth. They internalize the message that they are unworthy by default. Instead of being encouraged to explore, to question, or to see their capacities as good, they learn to see themselves as inherently flawed. Original sin is not just a theological concept. It is a psychological burden. It rewires the way people approach life, making them approach every decision with a shadow of shame behind it. The fear is not rationally evaluated. It is planted before reason even develops. One of the most telling features of this doctrine is how it shifts morality. Instead of morality being about learning, empathy, and responsibility, it becomes about erasing a stain you never put there. Morality is no longer about how you treat others, but about whether you have performed the right rituals to wash away invisible guilt. This is why baptism, confession, and constant repentance take center stage. They are not just spiritual practices. They are the cure prescribed for a sickness that was declared at birth. By defining people as sick, religion then sells the medicine. But unlike real medicine, which is tested and verified, this cure is only valid if you keep buying into the framework that defined you as sick in the first place. The fear of original sin has also influenced how societies view natural human instincts. Sexuality, curiosity, pleasure, and even ambition have been treated as symptoms of the sinful condition. Instead of seeing these traits as normal expressions of human nature, religion has labeled them as dangerous temptations tied to the inherited fault. This leads to repression, guilt, and cycles of self-denial. Entire communities have lived under the shadow of this fear, where joy itself becomes suspicious. If a person feels happiness in their body, they are taught to question whether it is sinful. This suspicion of human nature does not liberate people. It chains them to endless self-surveillance. The concept of inherited guilt also raises profound questions of justice. If a God is all-knowing and all-powerful, why would such a being design humanity in a way that could be permanently corrupted by one act? And if one act can contaminate billions, why can't a single act of goodness redeem billions without condition? The imbalance reveals the logic at work. It is not about justice or fairness. It is about creating a permanent need. If guilt is inherited, then no one can ever be free on their own. Everyone must rely on the authority that claims to hold the key to cleansing. The fear ensures that people never feel secure outside of obedience. Fear is not an accidental byproduct. It is the engine. Historically, this doctrine was formalized by theologians like Augustine, who argued that even infants who die without baptism are tainted and unworthy of salvation. This meant that the most vulnerable beings, babies who had never spoken or acted, were placed under the weight of eternal consequences. The terror this produced in parents cannot be underestimated. It drove entire populations to baptize newborns immediately, often within days of birth, out of fear that a child's soul might be condemned if anything went wrong. Fear of original sin thus shaped not only theology, but also family life, medical practices, and social rituals. The grip of fear extended into the most intimate corners of human experience. This fear has also been a convenient explanation for human suffering. Instead of asking why disease, natural disasters, and violence exist, the doctrine provides a ready answer. It is the fault of sin. By blaming the condition of humanity, it diverts attention away from real causes that could be studied and addressed. Why did people die from plagues? Not because of bacteria, but because humanity was fallen. Why do natural disasters happen? Because the earth itself was cursed by sin. Such explanations prevent progress. They frame suffering not as a problem to be solved, but as a punishment to be endured. Fear and guilt replace inquiry and action. It is no accident that societies dominated by this idea often lagged in scientific progress until people began to question the doctrine itself. Even when medicine and science eventually revealed natural explanations for disease and disaster, the fear of original sin lingered. People continued to feel that suffering was deserved, that misfortune was a reflection of inner guilt. This attitude seeps into culture. If someone struggles with poverty, illness, or failure, the unspoken assumption is often that they are in some way flawed or guilty. The fear does not stay confined to theology. It shapes how communities judge each other. It perpetuates stigma and shame. It creates a world where people are less compassionate because they believe flaws are deserved. The doctrine creates not only personal fear, but collective cruelty. The doctrine also works through repetition. A child hears it in Sunday school, in sermons, in hymns, and in prayers. They are reminded again and again that they are sinful by nature. The words become internalized. Over time, they are no longer heard as external claims, but as inner truth. The fear becomes self-sustaining. Even when someone tries to leave the religion, the residue of fear remains. They may no longer believe in the theology, but the shame has been drilled so deeply that it continues to haunt their thoughts. It is a kind of psychological scar that does not easily fade. Many people who step away from religion still report guilt over normal human behavior, showing how deep the fear of original sin can go. If one looks at the broader picture, original sin is not simply about theology or history. It is about how fear can be institutionalized. It is a case study in how an idea, once planted, can dominate not just individual lives, but entire cultures. It has shaped laws, attitudes towards sexuality, approaches to education, and even medical ethics. It has given institutions enormous power by convincing people that their deepest problem is not external oppression, but internal corruption. That way, instead of resisting power, people submit to it, believing that their own nature is the enemy. One of the most overlooked aspects of the doctrine is how it erodes trust in the body itself. Human beings are biological organisms shaped by millions of years of evolution, and the body has mechanisms for survival, reproduction, and well-being. Yet under the weight of original sin, the body is not celebrated but distrusted. Hunger, desire, and curiosity are treated as reminders of corruption rather than natural signals. This mistrust of the body has fueled ascetic practices, self-denial, and suspicion of pleasure. Monks, priests, and entire communities have been praised for rejecting their physical needs, not because such rejection made life healthier, but because it was framed as a battle against the sinful condition. What could be more effective at controlling people than convincing them to fear their own instincts? The damage extends to sexuality more than any other area. Because sexual desire is seen as the transmission point of original sin, passed through procreation, sexuality becomes linked to guilt from the start. This is why so many religious traditions surrounding Christianity have been obsessed with policing sex, marriage, and reproduction. Fear of original sin makes sexuality something dangerous, shameful, and in need of constant supervision. People raised with this framework often grow up unable to see their desires as normal. They see them instead as a battle against a cursed inheritance. The result is lifelong confusion, secrecy, and guilt over one of the most basic aspects of being human. The institutional power gained from this fear cannot be overstated. If people are convinced that their desires and instincts are untrustworthy, they will rely on external authorities to guide every choice. This explains why religious leaders historically position themselves as interpreters of morality, arbiters of marriage, and gatekeepers of salvation. By keeping the fear alive, they kept control. Every sermon on sin, every ritual of repentance, every warning of damnation worked to remind people that they were trapped unless they obeyed. This cycle has been extraordinarily effective in maintaining religious authority over centuries. When people are afraid of their own nature, they are easy to rule. The concept also plays into politics. Leaders who wanted unquestioning subjects found in original sin a ready-made justification. If humans are corrupt, then they cannot be trusted with too much freedom. If humans are naturally disobedient, then they need strong rulers. The doctrine supported authoritarian systems by portraying obedience as the only safeguard against chaos. Kings and clergy often worked together under this shared assumption. The king ruled bodies, the church ruled souls, and both relied on the belief that human beings, left on their own, would sink into sin. Fear of original sin thus became not only a religious idea, but also a political tool, reinforcing hierarchy at every level of society. Even today, traces of this fear persist in subtle ways. Many people who no longer actively believe in original sin still inherit cultural attitudes shaped by it. The tendency to see desire as dangerous, or to see curiosity as suspicious, or to feel guilt for pleasure. These are residues of a worldview built on inherited guilt. One does not need to be religious to carry the scars of a culture that was saturated in this teaching for centuries. Modern psychology still grapples with patients who feel shame without clear cause. Shame that often originates in childhood indoctrination about sin. This demonstrates how powerful the conditioning of fear can be. It lasts far beyond belief itself. When one examines the logic of inherited guilt, it becomes clear how flawed it is. If guilt can be inherited, why not virtue? If corruption can flow through generations, why not kindness, courage, or creativity? The selectivity reveals the purpose. It is not about fairness or truth, but about ensuring that people feel trapped. A system that only transmits guilt ensures that the cure remains necessary forever. This endless cycle is what keeps institutions alive. If one generation were declared clean, the entire structure would collapse. So fear must always be renewed, always transmitted, always reinforced. It is a self-perpetuating machine designed to keep people small. Original sin also distorts the idea of responsibility. In ordinary life, responsibility means being accountable for what you do, not for what someone else did thousands of years ago. But under this doctrine, responsibility becomes inherited. You are guilty for acts you did not commit. This makes real responsibility harder to grasp. It muddies the waters between personal action and inherited condition. People learn to see themselves as guilty by default, not by choice. This undermines the very concept of moral growth. If you are guilty before you act, what room is left for learning from mistakes? If you are condemned before you live, what is the point of moral development? The doctrine robs responsibility of its meaning and replaces it with submission. Another consequence is the way it has framed human history as a story of fallenness. Instead of seeing humanity as progressing, learning, and growing, religion paints history as a story of decline from an imagined perfection. The idea that humans were once pure and then fell into corruption creates nostalgia for a paradise that never existed. It also creates suspicion of progress. If the original state was perfection, then every attempt at growth is tainted by sin. This perspective has slowed social and scientific advancement by framing innovation as dangerous. Fear of original sin becomes fear of change itself. When curiosity is framed as disobedience, societies stagnate. When progress is seen as arrogance, communities remain stuck. The doctrine also raises troubling questions about justice in the afterlife. If guilt is inherited, then salvation becomes less about one's own actions and more about whether one has followed the correct ritual path. This leads to a vision of eternity where babies, children, or entire populations can be condemned simply because they were not cleansed by the right institution. Such a vision undermines the very idea of justice. Eternal reward or punishment no longer depends on choice but on accident of birth, culture, or ritual. This transforms religion from a system of moral guidance into a lottery of fear. The fear of missing the ritual, of dying unbaptized, of failing to confess. These fears drive people more than any sense of love or compassion. Fear, not justice, becomes the organizing principle. Throughout history, some thinkers have tried to soften the doctrine. They argued that original sin is symbolic, that it represents the human tendency to make mistakes. But the lived reality shows otherwise. In practice, churches have treated it as literal, using it to impose guilt and to maintain power. If it were merely symbolic, the rituals of cleansing would lose their urgency. The insistence on baptism, confession, and constant repentance proves that it is more than metaphor. The fear is real, because the consequences presented are absolute. The system does not allow room for symbolic interpretation when eternal damnation is the threat. What parent, faced with that fear, would risk treating it as mere metaphor? This is how fear wins, by offering no room for ambiguity. One of the most destructive effects of this doctrine is how it severs people from trust in their own capacity for goodness. If you are told from birth that you are corrupt, you begin to doubt every generous thought, every kind action, every creative impulse. Instead of trusting yourself, you learn to second-guess your motives. You begin to see goodness as something foreign, something that must come from outside, never from within. This alienation from one's own nature is devastating. It creates people who cannot see themselves as capable of genuine love or genuine morality. They believe they are always contaminated. Such a mindset weakens communities, because people who distrust themselves cannot fully trust others. Fear of original sin breeds suspicion, not only of the self, but of humanity as a whole. The doctrine also explains why so much emphasis in Christianity is placed on submission. If you are guilty by nature, then you cannot trust your judgment. If you are guilty by birth, then your only hope is obedience to authority. The fear undermines independence at its root. Even the act of questioning is framed as sinful. Curiosity itself was the crime in the garden, and so curiosity remains suspect. This is why so many believers are discouraged from asking hard questions about doctrine. Questioning is not seen as pursuit of truth, but as rebellion. And rebellion, according to the story, is the reason humanity has fallen in the first place. Fear of original sin thus guarantees silence. It ensures that people remain obedient not because they are convinced, but because they are afraid. The broader implication is that the doctrine traps people in a false dilemma. You are told that you are sick, then offered the cure. You are told you are guilty, then offered forgiveness. But the sickness and guilt were defined by the very system that sells the cure. It is a circular logic designed to be airtight. The more you fear, the more you obey. The more you obey, the more you reinforce the system. Breaking free requires questioning the premise itself. It requires asking why an all-powerful being would create a system so tilted toward guilt, fear, and dependence. The moment the premise is questioned, the fear begins to lose its grip. That is why questioning is portrayed as the greatest danger. Once people stop accepting the inherited guilt, the chains begin to loosen. One of the subtle ways the doctrine endures is through language. Even outside of church, words like sinful, fallen, or corrupt carry connotations rooted in the idea of original sin. These words are used in everyday speech to describe mistakes, desires, or even foods labeled as sinful indulgences. This casual use masks the heavy theological weight behind them, but still reinforces the association of pleasure with guilt. Language keeps the fear alive, not in explicit sermons, but in the quiet habits of speech that frame normal human experiences as shameful. It shows how deeply the doctrine has seeped into culture, shaping thought patterns long after explicit belief may fade. Education has also been shaped by this fear. In many periods of history, schooling in Christian contexts was not primarily about fostering curiosity, but about teaching obedience. The goal was not independent thinkers, but disciplined believers. The assumption was that human minds, tainted by sin, could not be trusted unless guided by strict authority. This is why questioning certain doctrines was treated as dangerous and even punishable. It was not merely disagreement. It was rebellion against the very structure designed to contain sin. When a system begins with the idea that every child is guilty at birth, education naturally becomes less about opening minds and more about restraining them. Fear determines not only what is taught, but how it is taught. The fear of original sin has also fueled cycles of violence. When communities believe that human beings are inherently corrupt, it becomes easier to justify harsh punishments, inquisitions, and even executions. If people are fallen by nature, then cruelty can be reframed as discipline. If corruption is inherited, then suppressing dissent can be painted as saving souls. History provides countless examples of this logic in action. Heretics burned, women accused of witchcraft, children beaten into submission, entire populations enslaved under the claim that they needed salvation. Fear of original sin was never just an internal feeling. It spilled outward into structures of control and violence. The doctrine created not only psychological scars, but also real bloodshed. the effect on women has been particularly destructive. Because the story of original sin blames Eve as the first transgressor, women have been portrayed as especially tied to the fall. This has justified their subordination in religious and social life. Women were told they were more easily deceived, more prone to temptation, more responsible for the world's corruption. The fear of original sin thus became gendered, laying a disproportionate burden on women. It cast suspicion on their voices, their leadership, their desires. It allowed patriarchal structures to portray their dominance not as oppression, but as protection against sin. Fear was not just a tool of religion, but a justification for inequality embedded in the social fabric. The doctrine also distorts the meaning of forgiveness. In ordinary human relationships, forgiveness is about resolving conflicts and healing wounds caused by real actions. But in this framework, forgiveness is needed not because of what someone has done, but because of what they are claimed to be. Forgiveness becomes endless because guilt is endless. It is not forgiveness of particular acts, but of an inherited condition that can never be erased. This means people are kept in a cycle where they must constantly seek pardon, never secure, never fully at peace. Forgiveness loses its meaning when it is applied not to actions, but to existence itself. The fear ensures that the need for forgiveness never ends. Another layer of harm is how the doctrine shifts focus away from real solutions to human problems. If the deepest issue is inherited sin, then social reforms, medical advances, or psychological healing become secondary. The real cure is always presented as spiritual, ritualistic, and under the control of religious authority. This mindset diverts energy away from tangible improvements in life. Instead of investing in better healthcare, societies invested in more churches. Instead of supporting scientific research, they supported theology. The fear redirected resources away from solving real problems and toward sustaining institutions. The doctrine thus not only shaped psychology and morality, but also slowed the material progress of societies locked in its grip. The concept of inherited guilt also undermines empathy. If you believe that everyone is guilty by nature, it becomes harder to see others as innocent victims of circumstance. This mindset can lead to harsh judgments of the poor, the sick, or the vulnerable. Instead of asking how systems create inequality or how disease spreads, people were taught to assume that suffering reflected sinfulness. This attitude persists today in subtle ways. When people say that someone brought it upon themselves, they echo the old logic of inherited guilt. The fear of original sin has not only shaped individual shame, but also weakened collective compassion. It creates a culture where empathy is suppressed in favor of suspicion. There is also the problem of how this doctrine frames childhood. A child is naturally curious, playful, and full of questions. Yet under this framework, childhood innocence is denied. Children are seen as needing correction from the start, as prone to sin, as needing rituals to cleanse them. This robs childhood of its natural freedom. It creates fear in parents who feel they must control their children tightly to save them from sin. It creates fear in children who grow up doubting their instincts and fearing punishment for thoughts and desires they barely understand. The joy of childhood is overshadowed by shame. Few doctrines have done more to burden children with unnecessary fear than the idea that they are guilty before they even know what guilt is. The persistence of original sin in culture also reveals how fear is often more powerful than reason. Even when people cannot explain the doctrine logically, they continue to feel its weight. They may laugh at the idea of Adam and Eve, yet still feel shame about their bodies or desires. This shows that fear does not need to be rational to be effective. It only needs to be planted early and repeated often. Fear becomes habit. Fear becomes instinct. And once it is internalized, it no longer requires external enforcement. People police themselves, their thoughts, their bodies. The most effective control is not chains on the body, but chains on the mind. Original sin achieved exactly that. One of the strangest features of the doctrine is how it creates a world divided between total despair and total dependence. On one hand, it tells you that you are hopelessly corrupt. On the other hand, it tells you that you can be saved, but only through submission to the system that defined you as corrupt in the first place. This back and forth creates constant anxiety. You are never secure, always in danger, always needing reassurance. This psychological state keeps people vulnerable. It makes them easier to manipulate with threats of hell or promises of heaven. The fear never fully resolves, because if it did, the system would lose its hold. Fear must be permanent, not temporary. That is why even the most devout are told to continually repent. The cycle is endless by design. In broader perspective, the fear of original sin can be seen as a mirror of human insecurity. Humans know they are imperfect, prone to mistakes, fragile, and mortal. Instead of accepting these realities, religion magnified them into cosmic guilt. It turned ordinary imperfection into eternal corruption. It took the natural fear of mortality and failure and transformed it into fear of divine punishment. This distortion not only deepened fear, but also directed it toward obedience to authority. By exaggerating human flaws into inherited sin, religion created an endless market for its rituals and promises. It transformed insecurity into dependence, and dependence into power. The result is a worldview that discourages people from ever feeling whole. If you are always guilty, you can never rest in yourself. You can never trust yourself. You are always at odds with your own nature. This disconnection is one of the most harmful legacies of the doctrine. It prevents people from fully living, fully experiencing, fully trusting their own humanity. Fear is not just an emotion in this system. It is the very lens through which life is seen. Fear is the water in which people swim, often without realizing it. And until the doctrine itself is questioned, the fear remains invisible but pervasive, shaping every thought and action. The influence of the doctrine can also be seen in how it shaped art, literature, and cultural imagination. Many of the great paintings, poems, and plays of the Western tradition carry the imprint of original sin. Artists portrayed humanity as fallen, stained, and desperate for redemption. Literature echoed themes of guilt, temptation, and corruption inherited from the garden myth. These works, while often beautiful in form, spread a message that life is fundamentally broken. Even when artists questioned the church, they often did so within the framework of inherited guilt, as if there were no alternative lens through which to understand the human condition. The doctrine had so thoroughly saturated culture that even its critics could not escape its influence. Fear became the backdrop against which imagination unfolded. The fear of original sin also intersected with the rise of confessional practices. The idea that guilt must be continually expressed, monitored, and forgiven created a culture of surveillance. People were encouraged to confess not only actions, but even thoughts, as if every desire was evidence of corruption. This constant monitoring eroded privacy and created a system where the most intimate parts of life were placed under religious authority. Fear drove people to reveal secrets they might otherwise have kept private, giving institutions more power over them. Confession was not simply a ritual of healing. It was a mechanism of control built on fear of sin. Without the doctrine of inherited guilt, such intrusive practices would never have been sustainable. The global spread of Christianity carried this fear far beyond its original cultural setting. As missionaries moved into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they brought not only their scriptures, but also the doctrine of original sin. Whole populations that had their own understandings of human nature, often more balanced and less guilt-ridden, were told they were cursed from birth. Indigenous cultures that celebrated fertility, sexuality, and the cycles of nature were suddenly confronted with teachings that labeled those very things as sinful. The fear of original sin clashed with traditions that saw life as sacred and good. Yet through colonization, these teachings were enforced, often violently. The doctrine became a tool of cultural domination, replacing local wisdom with fear-based control. This global imposition of fear reshaped societies. It turned rituals of joy into rituals of guilt. It turned natural cycles of life into reminders of sin. In many places, baptism became the first requirement of belonging to the new order, marking people not as inherently valuable, but as cleansed from inherited corruption. This process was not just spiritual, but political, aligning populations under the authority of colonizers and their churches. The fear of original sin thus became entangled with empire, conquest, and exploitation. It was not merely a theological concept, but a weapon of expansion, carrying with it the weight of both spiritual and political domination. In modern times, the fear has adapted rather than disappeared. Many churches today speak less explicitly about original sin, preferring softer language of brokenness or imperfection. Yet the core idea remains the same. You are not enough as you are, and you need external salvation. The language may shift, but the underlying message still creates dependence and guilt. This is evident in sermons that emphasize unworthiness, songs that focus on being washed clean, and prayers that highlight constant confession. Even when stripped of the harsher words, the framework of fear remains. People are still taught to see themselves as flawed at the root, incapable of goodness without divine intervention. The doctrine survives by disguising itself in gentler forms. The persistence of this idea shows how effective fear is as a social glue. Communities bonded not around trust or celebration of life, but around shared guilt and shared rituals of cleansing. Fear unified people by giving them a common problem. It created solidarity, but solidarity built on shame. This kind of unity is fragile and costly. It requires constant reinforcement, because guilt does not naturally hold people together the way joy or curiosity does. Fear-based unity demands constant reminders of sin, constant warnings of punishment, constant emphasis on dependence. Without fear, the bonds loosen. That is why the doctrine remains central. It keeps the community together, but at the expense of individual freedom and dignity. The doctrine also explains much of the hostility toward human progress in fields like science, medicine, and philosophy. If human nature is corrupt, then knowledge is dangerous. If desire for understanding is linked to the fall, then pursuing it is rebellion. This is why some of the greatest conflicts between religion and science have centered not just on facts, but on the underlying view of human nature. Scientists who studied the natural world were seen not as seekers of truth, but as challengers of divine authority. Fear of original sin made intellectual exploration suspect, as though curiosity itself carried guilt. It took centuries of struggle for societies to separate knowledge from sin. And even now, suspicion of science persists in communities where the doctrine of inherited guilt is still strong. At a deeper level, the doctrine reveals how religions often operate by redefining problems so that only they can provide the solutions. Human beings naturally feel insecurity, fear of death, and awareness of imperfection. Religion framed these feelings not as natural, but as evidence of inherited corruption. Once the problem was redefined, the religion offered the cure: rituals, obedience, and submission. This creates a closed loop where fear generates dependence, and dependence generates loyalty. The brilliance of the system lies in how it hides the fact that the problem was artificially defined in the first place. People are made to fear something that exists only within the framework of the doctrine itself. Once they accept the premise, they cannot escape the fear without abandoning the system entirely. The question worth asking is why such a harsh doctrine ever gained traction. The answer lies in power. A belief that every human is guilty from birth levels the ground. It does not matter if you are rich or poor, powerful or weak. Everyone is equally corrupt. This universality may sound fair, but it serves a deeper purpose. It places everyone equally under the control of the institution. No one can claim independence. No one can stand outside the system. By declaring everyone guilty, religion ensured that everyone needed it. Fear of original sin democratized guilt, but in doing so, it centralized power. It made the institution indispensable to all, because no one was exempt. The tragedy is that this doctrine blinds people to the reality that humans are capable of goodness without external authority. Communities around the world, long before Christianity, developed systems of cooperation, compassion, and justice without any notion of inherited guilt. Empathy and kindness are not foreign to human nature. They are part of it. But under the weight of original sin, people are told not to trust these instincts. They are told that every impulse toward good is tainted, that even generosity or love is corrupted unless sanctified by religion. This robs people of the chance to see their own capacity for morality. It turns what is natural into something suspicious. It alienates humanity from itself. The fear of original sin is thus not only a religious teaching, but a profound distortion of human identity. It takes natural imperfection and inflates it into cosmic rebellion. It takes mortality and turns it into eternal punishment. It takes ordinary insecurity and transforms it into dependence on authority. At every level, it replaces acceptance with shame, curiosity with suspicion, and independence with submission. The result is a worldview in which people are never whole, never free, never at peace. Fear becomes the foundation of existence, and guilt becomes the currency of belonging. The most revealing test of any belief system is whether it helps people flourish. When we look at the doctrine of original sin through that lens, its failure becomes obvious. Flourishing requires confidence, trust, and a sense of inherent worth. But this doctrine removes all three. It tells people they cannot trust themselves, that their worth is conditional, and that confidence is pride. It redefines human thriving as obedience and human happiness as dangerous temptation. Instead of lifting people up, it weighs them down. Instead of encouraging them to grow, it convinces them they are broken beyond repair. The fear it creates does not strengthen communities. It weakens them by filling members with shame and suspicion. The long shadow of this doctrine explains why so many cultures influenced by Christianity developed uneasy relationships with pleasure, the body, and human joy. In many other traditions, celebration is a central part of religious life. Feasting, dancing, and sexuality are integrated into community and ritual. But under the shadow of original sin, joy itself becomes suspect. Pleasure is often followed by guilt, as if feeling good is proof of corruption. This cycle robs people of the ability to simply exist in their bodies without shame. It turns natural rhythms into battlegrounds. Even moments of happiness become reminders of inherited guilt, because they are framed as temptations leading away from obedience. The fear of original sin has also warped the idea of justice in society. If everyone is guilty by nature, then punishment becomes easier to justify. Harsh laws, severe penalties, and unforgiving systems of control are easier to defend if you begin from the belief that people are inherently corrupt. This has influenced not only religious institutions, but also secular governments that inherited the worldview. Entire legal systems have been built on the assumption that people cannot be trusted. Mercy, rehabilitation, and compassion have often been sidelined in favor of fear-based control. The doctrine thus extends its influence beyond religion, shaping politics, law, and culture in ways many people no longer recognize. Psychologically, the doctrine plants the seeds of self-hatred. If your very existence is framed as guilty, then no amount of effort can fully heal the wound. People spend their lives seeking approval, not just from religious authorities, but from others, trying to prove they are worthy. This creates cycles of perfectionism, anxiety, and despair. Even outside of religious belief, many carry this conditioning into their relationships, careers, and personal struggles. They feel inadequate by default, as if they must constantly earn the right to exist. The fear has done its work so thoroughly that it no longer requires explicit sermons to survive. It lives in the way people treat themselves, often harshly, without knowing why. The doctrine also explains why many who leave religion still wrestle with guilt for years afterward. They may reject the theology, yet the emotional conditioning remains. They may logically know that the story of Adam and Eve is a myth, but they still feel unclean when they experience desire or doubt. This shows how powerful fear can be when implanted in early childhood. It becomes part of the nervous system, shaping reactions at a level deeper than reason. Escaping it is not simply a matter of changing beliefs, but of unlearning habits of fear that were drilled in from the beginning. The doctrine leaves scars that last long after faith has faded. A striking irony lies at the heart of this teaching. If original sin is true, then the God who created humanity designed a system where guilt is automatic. That means guilt is not the result of human rebellion, but of divine intention. If every human is guilty by default, then the blame rests not with humanity, but with the Creator who made the rules. The doctrine collapses under its own logic, yet it survives because questioning it is framed as rebellion. Fear silences the obvious objection. Why would a just being punish children for the mistakes of distant ancestors? The moment this question is asked honestly, the fear begins to lose its grip. That is why silence is enforced. The doctrine survives not because it makes sense, but because fear makes people too afraid to question it. At its root, original sin is a story about power. It creates a permanent wound and then offers a permanent cure controlled by an institution. It generates dependence that cannot end because the guilt never ends. The brilliance of the system lies in its simplicity. By declaring all people broken at the core, it ensures that no one can escape its reach. By making guilt universal, it makes authority universal. Fear of original sin thus functions less as a theological truth and more as a mechanism of social engineering. It produces exactly the kind of population any authority would want: obedient, anxious, and unable to trust themselves. The alternative is not denial of human imperfection. Humans do make mistakes. They are fragile, limited, and prone to error. But imperfection is not the same as inherited guilt. Mistakes are opportunities for growth, not evidence of corruption. Mortality is a natural fact, not a divine punishment. Desire is a biological drive, not a mark of rebellion. By framing these realities as sin, religion distorted them into tools of fear. The challenge for humanity is to reclaim these aspects of existence without shame, to see imperfection as part of life, not as proof of cosmic guilt, to see mortality as natural, not as condemnation, to see desire as human, not as corrupt. Without the fear of original sin, these things can be faced with acceptance rather than shame. When people begin to let go of this fear, the results are profound. They discover that they can trust their own instincts for kindness. They realize that morality does not depend on ritual, but on empathy. They see that their worth is not conditional, but inherent. They learn that curiosity is not rebellion, but growth. In short, they begin to live free of the shadow of inherited guilt. The weight lifts, and with it comes a new sense of dignity. This is not theoretical. It has happened for countless people who stepped away from the doctrine and found that life did not collapse without it. On the contrary, life became fuller, freer, and more meaningful once the fear was gone. The fear of original sin has shaped much of human history, but it does not need to shape the future. The fact that people still feel its weight shows how deeply fear can be embedded. But the fact that people can escape it shows that it is not inescapable. By questioning its logic, exposing its effects, and recognizing its role in maintaining power, individuals and societies can loosen its hold. Fear thrives in silence, but it weakens under examination. When people speak openly about the harm caused by the doctrine, its authority diminishes. When people begin to trust their own capacity for goodness, its necessity disappears. Fear of original sin can only control those who accept it. The moment it is rejected, the chains begin to break. In the end, the story of original sin is not about two people in a garden. It is about how fear can be manufactured, institutionalized, and passed down for generations. It is about how human beings can be convinced to distrust themselves, to submit to authority, and to live under the weight of guilt that was never theirs to carry. But it is also about how fear can be overcome. By reclaiming trust in human nature, by rejecting inherited guilt, and by recognizing the power of empathy and reason, people can step out of the shadow of this doctrine. They can live not as fallen beings, but as human beings, imperfect, yes, but not condemned. The fear of original sin does not define humanity. The courage to question it does.